Whenever you're ready. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The few that are here and the masses online, thank you for connecting up to us. Today's talk is the development of early iron armor plates and the challenge from improving guns and shot by David Boursnell. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just moving on straight from the first slide to what I'm going to be talking about. What I've tried to do talks I've given previously have been mostly about armour, but I thought since I was in Newcastle, it would be wrong not to talk a bit about the other side of the equation, which is the guns. So I've tried to balance those two. So basically what I'm going to be talking about is starting off with the Crimean War, which was the innovation for a number of developments in this field. And then looking at the armour makers of the Crimean War, primarily the Thames Iron Works and the Park Gate Iron Works. And then post the Crimean War, there was a brief period of peace, and then we started another dispute with the French, which led to the development of an ironclad fleet, which meant that everything had to be scaled up in scale, obviously. And as a result of that, a special committee on iron was set up, which carried on a whole series of experiments into armour plate and how it was best to make armour plate and how it was best to actually fire things at armour plate. And that led to a huge improvement in the quality of armour plate. But the next thing also, the gun makers responded and built bigger and better guns. And then the last section is looking at how the armour makers responded. And I'm looking at 4 companies, John Brown and Co., the Mersey Iron Works, the Millwall Iron Works, and Charles Camel and Co. And just to start off with the juxtaposition between 2 people involved in opposite ends of the things, the armour and artillery. In 1861, John Brown gave a talk at the meeting of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in Sheffield, when he laid out in a paper how they made rolled armour plate for the first time at John Brown in 1861. And the meeting was chaired by William Armstrong, who said in introducing John Brown that he felt a great interest in the manufacture of armour plates because he was trying to sort them out with bigger guns. And that's the sort of thing that I want to just reflect on throughout the talk. So moving on to the Crimean War, I'm sure people are relatively familiar with it, and much of the areas where it was fought are very much in the news at the moment around the Crimea and Sevastopol. It was fought against Russia by an alliance of Turkey, France, and Britain. And although it's called the Crimean War, it was actually much more of a worldwide war. A lot of activity in the Baltic and also in the Far East as well, which doesn't get a lot of press. And the Baltic was more important to the British government because basically the Baltic and containing the Russian fleet in the Baltic is much nearer geographically to Britain, and we didn't want the Russian fleet exiting the Baltic. But the Russian fleet, their strategy that they had in the Crimean War was primarily defensive. It's what Marne, the naval theorists, call a fortress fleet. They basically were in their harbour, defending their harbours and their land fortifications, rather than coming out and challenging the British fleet on the open sea, British and French fleet on the open sea, which was probably a sensible strategy, as they would have been wiped out fairly quickly. So in order to attack the Russian fleet and the Russian land fortifications, the British and French governments embarked on something called the Great Armament. And this involved building an enormous fleet of armoured batteries, gun vessels and mortar vessels. And to do this, they needed to use a whole series of yards and ironworks, which they hadn't used before. And so this involved ironworks right across the country. And we've got here a picture of an armour-clad battery, which were developed jointly by the French and the British. French and particularly Napoleon III have got a fair amount of credit for it, but the British were very involved in developing them at all. And as you can see from the picture on the right of the Meteor and Thunder, these were flat-bottomed barges essentially, and had to be towed out to the Crimea, not seaworthy at all, but could just about make it to be sailed in towards the shoreline. And the first time they were used was at the Battle of Kinburn. Kinburn is at the mouth of the river Dnepr, or I think it's called Dnipro in Ukrainian now, and essentially is very much on the front line at the moment between the Russian and the Ukrainian fleet. This is the mouth of the river, a huge sand spit coming along here. And the French batteries, which were ready earlier than the British batteries, participated in this battle. What happened is that trying to get an indicator, I can't do that. So the batteries here, you can see 3 batteries down here, and they're up with where the other arrow is. And then the large fleet of the large sort of Napoleon War type 3-decker battleships out of range of these batteries, which were firing shells at wooden ships, which is not a good thing to be a sailor when that's happening. But the batteries and a fleet of gunboats managed to suppress the fire so that the larger fleet could move in and batter the forts into submission. Now, the problem is that that was a fairly rudimentary structure, those forts on that spit. And if you wanted to attack Kronstadt, which defended St. Petersburg, this looked more like this, and it was a much more formidable obstacle. You can see the forts in the bottom, lined with guns, a series of forts further out in the estuary, one in the big one in the middle and one on the far side. Sailing through that would have been a much more serious challenge, and that required a different sort of warship. And what the Admiralty did is they ordered 3 iron-hulled batteries. I should have said that the previous batteries were wooden-hulled barges with armour plate attached on the sides. They built 3 iron-hulled armoured batteries, and they built them at shipyards which were used to building in iron, which none of the naval shipyards were. They were all used to building in wood. Shipbuilding in iron was a relatively new technology and was certainly far too innovative for the British Admiralty, really. Hadn't adapted to it at all. And the one that we're going to look at in particular is HMS Terror, which was built at Palmer's down in Jarrow. They started in about, I think, 1852 from memory, so they were a relatively new company. And the Terror was ordered in 1855. Work started late in the year, and by mid-April it was launched. So a fairly quick operation to get the ship out and ready for action. I should say that actually before any of those ships were ready, peace had been declared, and so they were never used. But the development of the iron-hulled iron arm battery was a precursor for the development of an armoured navy later on. So moving to the Crimean War and develops in gunnery on the other side, effectively field artillery used in the Crimean War, particularly British field artillery, was very out of date. It hadn't developed from the Napoleonic Wars. It was cast iron cannon, which were cast and then bored out. And they were very, very heavy and difficult to move around and not very accurate. And small arms, such as the Enfield rifle, had a longer range, giving riflemen the ability to shoot and take people out in batteries. And so the infantry were more powerful in effect than the batteries. And the Battle of Inkerman received a lot of publicity in the British press. It took 150 men to drag the cast iron guns weighing 2 tons over 1.5 miles of country. As a result, the Russian army coming out of Sevastopol inflicted very heavy casualties on the British army because it took them so long to move that battery. And William Armstrong, who was actually in London at the time with Stuart Rendell, because, and then another innovation of the Crimean War, this was reported very, very quickly because the telegraph had been invented. And so press reports and events like this, as opposed to taking 6 months to appear, were seen instantly. He decided to build a field gun using modern principles of engineering. And in 1855, he built a 3-pounder field gun. In 1858, he had successful trials of an 18-pounder gun at Shoebury Ness, which is on the Essex coast. It's the Royal Artillery's firing range. And there was a committee set up to evaluate Armstrong's guns against Whitworth guns later in that year. The secretary was Captain Andrew Noble, who I'm sure people will have heard of, came to work for Armstrong later on. And the Whitworth and the Armstrong weren't the only gun makers around at the time. There was a meeting of the IME, and I think 1862, at which there were 16 gun makers who all had a chance to speak, and the meeting took place over 4 days. And it was extremely well chaired, but fairly formally polite, as people slagged each other off and told people about why their system of gun making was much better. So in November, the committee recommended the adoption of Armstrong gun because it was 57 times more accurate than common artillery. And this is a picture of a 110-pound Armstrong breech loader. And you can see basically here, you've got the barrel, which was rifled. You've got the breech loading thing, so you can put the shot or shell in there. And then it had fused onto it wrought iron rings to enable the gun to resist the pressure of the exploding charge. And Armstrong was appointed the engineer of rifled ordnance and the superintendent of the Royal Gun Factory at Woolwich. And he set up the Ellsworth Ordnance Company under George Rendell, later joined by Andrew Noble, who had recommended the Armstrong gun for adoption. It's quite interesting, as a bit of a detour, that in selecting the sort of gun that they were using, they actually set up a competition with one winner. And we'll look later on at actually a slightly different approach that they adopted when they were choosing armour plate, which was much more broad to establish a standard and try and get as many people working to that standard as possible. So building up the Armstrong gun, I've got here a picture of Thomas Firth and Sons clay wheel Lane in Sheffield. And this is where the early steel inner tubes for the guns were made. And this is a quote from, it says that it's missing at the bottom, Markforth later on. The order from Woolwich is for the barrel for the Armstrong gun. And if they adopt it, they will require a piece for every Armstrong gun, which will be a very large quantity. By the time although they made the earlier barrels there, by the time they got the large order in the 60s, they'd moved it into their larger works at Norfolk. But I put this in because it's about half a mile from my house. So I thought I'd sneak it in. And then the wrought iron hoops, which were wrapped around the barrel, were made from spirals of wrought iron, which were heated and fused together. And those were made at a number of foundries, mostly in Yorkshire, in Leeds, in Sheffield, and the like. So there were two leading armour makers who emerged from the Crimean War, and those were Thames Iron Works, which was at the time was called C.J. Mayer & Co., and Samuel Beale. And the key figures, as you can see there, Charles Mayer and Thomas Ditchburn. Charles Mayer was a solicitor and was the sort of money man and entrepreneur, and Thomas Ditchburn was the naval architect. And Samuel Beale & Co., Samuel Beale on the right, and Charles Geach, who was a banker and sort of serial entrepreneur and investor. Charles Geach was the senior partner who held the most shares and brought in Samuel Beale later on. And I think the reason why it was called Samuel Beale is that Charles Geach had his finger in many pies. He was a banker by trade, managing director of the Birmingham Midland Bank, which became the Midland Bank, and wanted to keep his involvement at a lower key. So just to briefly cover the Thames Iron Works, it was situated on the River Lee, and it's just here on the other side of the Livery, the Essex side of the River Lee, and this is Greenwich just down here, yeah, and the O2 Arena, yeah, just on the Greenwich Peninsula there. So right in the heart of London. Thomas Ditchburn left after Charles Mayer insisted on moving across onto the Essex side, and in 1855 Charles Mayer was declared bankrupt, not for the last time. He ran 2 stables of racing horses and was very involved in that, and sometimes apparently money was diverted from the wage bill of Thames Iron Works to pay for his racing debts and the cost of upkeep of his horses. Luckily, he had a father-in-law, Peter Rolt, who was rather well off, and he took over the Ailing Company and renamed it the Thames Iron Works. And this is a picture of the iron forge at C.J. Mayer in 1854 during the Crimean War, when they were making armour for the armoured batteries. And you can see in the background here, this is their rolling mill. They didn't use the rolling mill for making armour, but they did use it for making ships' plates. They were determined that hammering was the better way of making armour plate, and we'll come to the pros and cons of that later on. But you can see here, I mean, I think it's slightly a compilation picture, this, rather than extremely accurate. I think what they're doing around here is sorting scrap iron, because they made the plates from scrap iron, which was collected by, from the streets of London. Although later on they changed to using cut-up railway tires, which had been worked, by the action of railways, and were therefore better for high-quality armour. They received the order for 2 wooden floating batteries, the Meteor and Thunder, which we had a look at the picture of earlier. And Captain John Ford, who joined them later, was a huge supporter for the process of hammering iron plates. And he was of the view that hammering was by far the best method. Now going to look at Samuel Beal, and who are the other company who were prominent in making armour plates at the time. This was formed in 1823 by Charles Sanderson and Thomas Watson. In 1838, they were also declared bankrupt. It was a sort of problem at the time, is that some of these firms were a bit flaky financially. And in 1842, Charles Geach bought a majority shareholding. 1845, Samuel Beal joined the partnership. And in 1845, they built a rail mill. And this was really the purpose of Samuel Beal and Co. Samuel Beal was very large player in railways and was vice chairman of the Midland Railway. And it was for building things for railways that they were really interested in it. However, in 1852 and shortly afterwards, they became very involved in the Great Eastern, the enormous Leviathan or monster ship, as it was known, which was built by Brunel of these two figures on the right here, and John Scott Russell on the left, who owned the Millwall shipyard and was one of the leading naval architects of the day. And this is a picture of Brunel's first sketch for the ship. It was so large because it was designed to go to Australia without refueling, because there was a problem with setting up fueling depots all the way around, supplied with coal. The difficulty was that actually, A, there wasn't a market to actually carry that number of passengers to Australia, and B, it was so large that there wasn't a port large enough to take it. So it was an interesting engineering challenge, but not necessarily the best business investment. And here we have a page from a ledger of the Parkgate Iron Company, and you can see here at the bottom here, it's labelled John Scott Russell and Co, Millwall, and then underneath, I've blown it up a bit, it's for the monster ship. Very interesting little accounts book, these. They're about 6 inches by 4 inches, which you could fit in your back pocket, which I think is a sort of the iPad of its day, that the clerk of their head office was in London could sort of carry around with him and monitor people. So the first rolled armour plates were developed by Samuel Beal at the request of Armour and Co. And I've already things they had got that plates for their early collier ships from Palmer's, and in 1854 Palmer's gave Samuel Beal and Co the order for the first rolled armour plates. And this is a quote from Charles Palmer in 1863, basically saying that because all the ironworks were busy, that he went to Parkgate, which was the largest plate mill at the time, and they employed Samuel Beal and Co. But the Admiralty demanded that rolled armour plates were tested, so they had to be tested by the Admiralty first, and they were, and they beat the hammered armour plates, according to Charles Palmer. I can find no record of these tests at all, but Charles Palmer said that they took place. And here we have the plates being made from the same little order book that I referred to previously. And you can see here in pencil against it, it says battery plates, yeah, which is for the armoured batteries. So this is the first record I can find of armour plates being made by rolling in black and white. After the Crimean War, tension built up between France and Britain, and the French decided to build 3 armoured frigates, the best known of which is La Gloire, sorry. And there's a picture of that ship here. French were known historically for their elegant ships. I don't think this quite meets that criteria, but it was a wooden ship coated with armor plate, the same as the batteries, and really triggered off a huge arms race between the British and the French. And the British responded by building 2 iron-hulled armoured frigates, which were HMS Warrior, now in Portsmouth, of course, and HMS Black Prince, which was built in Glasgow, 2 virtually identical ships. I love this photograph of Sir William Fairbairn looking extremely grumpy. And he had been pushing for the Navy to build iron ships for some time. And this quote says, "On finishing the Warrior, the government bethought themselves that it would be desirable what they ought to have done 5 years previously, namely to ascertain something about the principles which should guide the design of iron armour." It's a bit unfair. They were doing experiments, they were trying things out, but hadn't been doing so in a systematic and scientific enough way for William Fairbairn. And a committee on iron plates and guns was set up in 1859, which was replaced in 1861 by a different committee, the Special Committee on Iron, which was run by the Admiralty rather than the War Office. And this was quite a high-powered committee. It was chaired by Captain John Dalrymple Hay, MP, who was a very political admiral indeed. He became an admiral, very political sailor indeed. And the members were Major William Jervois from the Royal Engineers. He was an expert in fortifications, so knew about defences. William Henderson from the Royal Artillery. The Royal Artillery were clearly the experts on guns and the like. And 3 FRS is Dr. John Percy from the Royal Schools of Mine, who was the author of Metallurgy of Iron and Steel. So he was the person who was the metallurgist. And Fairbairn and Pole, fairly eminent engineers who carried out a lot of experiments on armour plate. And their brief was to ascertain the thickness, size and weight of armour plates, the best sort of armour plates, tested against a variety of weight and material, testing the resistance of different qualities of iron plates, and monitoring how they're made, measuring the chemical composition, specific gravity, etc. of plates, and recording every particular of each experiment, which they did in 4 detailed reports, which make very interesting reading if you're obsessed about armour plates as I am, not otherwise. And they carried out a number of experiments on sample plates, tests of targets representing the sides of ships, different types of shot and shell, and the mechanical and chemical properties of armour. And I've recently been to the Royal Society, who have 7 volumes of photographs, which were published by the committee separately from their written reports, and really haven't seen the light of day. But this is a picture of the 4 of the plates, which I can't read because of the thing, so I'll try and remember. But the one on the left, they're 3-inch plates fired up by an Armstrong 40-pounder gun. The one on the left is from the Thames Iron Works, which is made by hammering. And you can see the shots arrived straight in the middle and it's cracked, yeah, in 4 directions. The next one along, which is from Shortridge and Howell, who are a Sheffield company, and they made cast steel armour plates, which a lot of people were arguing was the way forward to make armour plates of steel. But because of their carbon content, they were much more brittle than the wrought iron, and didn't stick. And you can see that this one, top and left, has got some fairly severe cracks in, and actually the cracks on the rear are even worse. The third one along is from Samuel Beal and Co., which seems to have come out the best, but again, did crack at the back. And the last one, the Low Moor, which is fairly cracked. Low Moor was sort of reputed to be one of the best makers of wrought iron in the country from Bradford. And this is just an example of the things that they were doing. So in total, between 1858 and 1864, they recorded 350 tests on armour plates. That's one-off tests on armour plates. They had enormous difficulty, really, and if you're reading it, it's quite interesting in terms of actually just trying to change one thing at a time so that you can see what the result of the change you've made has on the armour. They tended to change 2 or 3 things at a time. They also had enormous difficulty in actually trying to describe what the effect of a shot on an armour plate was. And eventually they came up with a order of merit score with A1, A2, A3, A4, B1, 2, 3, and 4. B4 being a plate of no value whatsoever, A1 being a superior plate, and the A plates were of acceptable quality, the B plates weren't of acceptable quality. The difficulty was that it's a bit like A-level grades. You know, you can get an algorithm to fiddle around with them, to adjust them, and that's what happened here, because as people, captains of HMS Excellent, who were the people which is the Naval Gunnery School, who carried out the experiments, as the captains changed, their view of the plates did, and they themselves admitted that as plates improved, it became more and more difficult to get an A1 things, but they maintained that the dividing line here between the A's and the B's stayed the same. And this was one of the major problems of actually defining how well plates were doing. They then went to firing tests on targets, and they built a series of tests. These weren't carried out at Portsmouth by the Admiralty. These were carried out at Shoeburyness on the Essex coast, basically because it's a bit difficult to fire at whacking great structures like that in the middle of Portsmouth Harbour. And this is the Warrior target, and represents the side of HMS Warrior. So you can see on the outside of it, there's 4.5 inches of armour plate. Next to it, there's 8 inches of oak running vertically. Behind that, another 10 inches of oak running horizontally. There's then the 5/8 ship's plate, which you can't really see on the target itself, and then the ship's ribs next. And these were used. I mean, this is I was sort of saying, you know, the tests on individual armour plates are really interesting if you're actually interested in the manufacture of armour plates and how they stand up and how hammered the old armour plates do. If you're a sailor, this is a much more interesting test. You know, it's, will you be safe behind this whacking great barrier? So one of the things that they actually tried to do, and one of the problems, is that the whole science of kinetic energy wasn't really developed at this point. The concept of vis viva, which was life force, was understood, but it was very difficult to actually decide what the velocity was, and therefore you couldn't actually measure, you know, the kinetic energy. And this was the system that they adopted, a system invented by a Belgian artillery officer called Major Auguste Naves. And you can see here that there were two, well, you can see just around the bottom, there were 2 screens which you made of wire mesh, which you separated out by a decent distance. And these were fed by wires into a couple of coils here on Fig 5 on the right. And when the shot passed through the mesh, it broke the connection, and the coils released a pendulum onto a drum, which made a mark. And then similarly with the second screen, and you could measure the velocity. And that made an enormous difference, because they could start to do proper scientific experiments on armor plates and guns. And Captain Noble and others, but Captain Andrew Noble and William Henry Noble, who I don't think were related, did extensive experiments measuring different types of shots traveling at the same with the same kinetic energy and the effect that they had on plates. So one of the things that was problematical is when the shell hits the plate, I beg your pardon, the shot hits the plate, nobody really knew what happened to it. And obviously a large amount of the energy that the shot was carrying went into the plate, but also a large amount was used up distorting the plate, the shot itself. And this is a quote from William Armstrong, based on experiments he and Captain Noble did to work out how much of the energy of shots was absorbed by the plate. And the way they did that was they collected bits of the shot and put it in a bucket of water and then measured the change in the temperature of the bucket of water. So they were able to measure fairly accurately well-tempered steel, and they worked out that that's 10% of its energy in distorting and heating up the shot. Soft steel lost 20%, wrought iron lost about 50%, and down right at the bottom, cast iron lost more than 50%. And the reason why they couldn't be exact about the cast iron was because the cast iron round shots broke into thousands of pieces, and it was extremely difficult to have people scuttling around, picking up all these pieces and putting them into the bucket before they got cold. So it was a much more of an approximation. But again, really important in the development of the process, knowing what sort of shot and shell you should use to penetrate armor plates. And this is just a picture of a range of different shots and shells which they employed. You can see that up in the top right, you've got some very flat and round shot, traditional wrought iron or cast iron round shot. And then you've got different shots here with flat-headed elongated projectiles, round-headed elongated projectiles. Basically you can see some of these are used and some of them are unused, but the distortion that takes place absorbing a lot of energy of the shot. Now, the last category of experiments I'm going to talk about is the mechanical and chemical tests, which William Fairbairn carried out at his laboratories in Manchester. And they measured the resistance of samples of armor plate to tension, compression, and indentation from various different sorts of shapes of punches. And William Pole tested the chemical composition of all sorts of things. And the difficulty was that although they had collected an enormous amount of data, they could find no relationship between the data they collected and the actual performance of the plates. So something could have a certain tension, compression, indentation, but it showed it had no relationship whatsoever to the way it performed when it was hit by a giant shell, because they couldn't replicate that. So the only way of testing armor plates in the end was actually firing large iron objects at them. In terms of mechanical and other tests, one of the interesting things I've looked at and been digging into recently is the work of Henry Sorby, who was a Sheffield microscopist, who in 1863 was approached by Samuel Beal and Co. It was Samuel Beal's nephew, William Phipson Beal, who had trained as a chemist in Heidelberg and then went to work for Samuel Beal and Co. And he asked Sorby, he encouraged him to, he'd been looking at meteorites and cutting samples of those to look at the structure of those. And the plate on the right, you can see, is an armor plate, yeah, from Park Gate across the top, and HCS Henry Clifton Sorby in 1864. Unfortunately, due to the nature of trying to produce slides and actually looking at them through a microscope, the technology at that stage wasn't up to the job, really. But these early start things, and it's interesting in that the armor makers were actually trying to understand the structure of the products that they can make. Sorby actually reported on it to the Institute of Iron and Steel in about the mid-1880s. The committee also heard evidence from the leading armor plate makers. One of the reasons why they did this is that everybody was working individually, and they were quite interested in finding out how people made the plates and then spreading good practice to the armor trade. The little red blob in there is just to tell myself how I'm doing, is to show that we're at half time. So hopefully I'll finish in time. Captain Dyer, who was a member of the Royal Artillery, basically said that the problem was that all the armor makers had never been invited to the tests to test their products. Therefore, they had no idea how they got on. So part of the process was actually inviting the firms to the tests, and they went as a group because they'd run 5 or 6, and they'd look at them and they were able to compare the performance of their plate to other plates, and thus good practice was spread throughout the industry. And what we have here is the number of companies that were involved in making armor plates and submitting them to the Committee on Iron. And I've divided these by regions. So we have a couple from up here, Weardale and Ellswick tried to make 4. The numbers after them is the number of plates they submitted for testing. You've got 1, Rigby and Beardmore, which is Napier's, Charles Napier, who Napier's, sorry, it's not Charles Napier, who built the Black Prince. The Bowling Iron Company, Lowmore from Bradford, Monksbridge from Leeds, and then 4 from South Yorkshire, 3 from London, 3 from Wales, the Butterley Company from Derbyshire, and the Dudley Company from the West Midlands, sorry. So first of all, looking at William Hardy from the Thames Iron Works and the evidence he gave, they didn't make their iron completely from scrap, as they'd been ordered to include some puddle iron by the Admiralty. They were very reluctant to do so, but had been instructed. The puddle iron was brought from the Milton Iron Works in Barnsley. They cut the scrap up into pieces. The paint was burnt off, and they then piled bars of mixed of puddles and scrap iron in layers, and each layer was crossed, yeah, with the other layer. And the scrap iron they described as being softer, tougher, and of better quality. Each pile weighed 400 weight. They heated it in the furnace and hammered it into slabs. And then they took 3 of these slabs and hammered them together to form a short blade, 3 foot wide and 4.5 inches thick, using a 4-ton Naismith hammer. That was put back into the furnace with another plate, and the 2 were brought together to a welding heat and welded together using an 18-inch scarf overlap, scarf joint. And when the hammering process was finished, the plates were very hard, and they were annealed by heating them up again and cooling them slowly. So this is my very rough approximation of the process. Here you can see the Naismith hammer at the top and the anvil at the bottom, and the red hot plate coming out of the furnace. The hammer goes up and down and beats it together. Yeah. And this is a picture of the forge at Pétain and Godet. They're a French firm, but the reason why I'm using this is it illustrates the point I want to make particularly well. They actually hammered the armor plate for the Gloire. So they were involved in making armor plate by hammering. But the picture here is clearly not an armor plate. It's some sort of shaft, yeah, that they're making. But it really illustrates the problem of accurately hammering a plate. Because if you can imagine with that scarf joint, the hammer falls on one point and you've got to move both plates together, yeah, so that the next blow falls in the right place. And here you can see the crew right on the right-hand side of the screen maneuvering, yeah, the object, which is suspended from the ceiling. And you can see the amount of energy they're having to put into it, directed by the chap in the middle there who's saying, à gauche, à droite, yeah, or whatever, yeah, to try and get them to move the plate to the right time. And then there's the hammerman up here who has to release, yeah, the hammer at exactly the right time so that it falls on the right place. Now, that could be done, but it was extremely difficult, yeah. And the problem, just going back to the previous things which I missed from the back, is the problem is that it was because it was difficult to get the hammer in the same place. Individual plates were extremely patchy. Yeah, they were very good where they got it right, but if the hammer missed a bit, the plates didn't fuse properly, and there were weaknesses in it. So George Grant Sanderson, who was the manager of Samuel Beal & Co, and their chief person responsible for making armor plate, described how they made it. And they again started with scrap iron and puddled iron in 12-inch bars. They pearled it together, interestingly using the opposite proportion of scrap and puddles to Thames Iron Works, and using different bars on the inside and outside of the pile. They were piled together and they were rolled into a small plate. These were 1¼ inches thick, and 4 of those were put together in the furnace and rolled into another slab 2½ inches thick, and the rough iron was cut off the outside, so all the plates were the same size. And the 4 2¼ plates were then heated in the furnace and rolled into the final plate. The rollers they used were 20 inches in diameter and 6½ feet long. And I think they were designed originally, I've seen no evidence that they replaced their rolling mill for ship's plates, which were about 1 inch thick, that they replaced their roller. So the roller they used was the same one as used for ship's plates, and this basically was struggling to squish, you have to use a technical term, all of those plates together. So they heated them for 4 or 5 hours. They pull them out by a pair of tongs attached to a chain on the top roller, and the plates travel down an inclined track, losing very little heat because they traveled at a fair lick. And the rollers had a reversing mechanism, and the plates were rolled back and forwards for about 3 minutes until they were 4½ inches thick. And the plate was then straightened with a large roller while hot, and the plates were then allowed to cool and the edges trimmed. Unfortunately, there's no picture of that things, but there are pictures of a similar process later on, which we'll come to. So basically, this is looking at their process. You have 10 bars in a pile, yeah, a pile of bars, 10 inches things, laid in opposite directions. Each bar is 10, and you put 4 of those together, which is giving you 40 layers. You add 4 of those together, which is giving you 160 layers to get the final plate. And the difficulty with it is actually getting enough force on your rollers to make sure that those are squished completely properly. There's a danger of having a sort of milfoil effect where the pastry layers, just things, any dirt, any pockets of air, etc., are going to cause havoc in the final plate. And Robert Mallet, who was a well-known engineer, basically said the rolling mills that are in existence are not sufficiently powerful enough to give enough pinch on the iron rolls to close up the particles of iron. In 1861, the report of Parliament examined a whole load of plates and reported that 44 of Samuel Beal & Co.'s plates were not up to scratch because they were poorly welded. And this is what they meant by this. This is actually not a Samuel Beal & Co. plate, but it's a rolled plate from slightly later, demonstrating the problem of lamination. Is that the top side of this plate at the bottom here is the front of it where the shots have hit here, and you can see that the plate is splitting along the various levels of plate where it's been from the component layers of plate, which didn't do the plate any good at all. So eventually the Special Committee on Iron came to their conclusions that no material for armour plates yet submitted has been found to be equal to wrought iron of the softest quality, not hard iron. The method of making it is that their trials with hammered and rolled plates showed the superiority of rolled ones for the reasons that we've discussed before. The hammered plates were inconsistent, whereas the rolled plates were more consistent, but not necessarily of the highest quality. And what they were going for here was reliability. That was the key thing that they wanted. And they didn't want plates bolted to the side of ships to crack and fall off and leave the wood underneath exposed. They thought that you couldn't actually get a plate thicker than 5.5 inches that was properly made together and wouldn't split into layers because the rollers weren't powerful enough, and that a soft wooden backing distributes the power of the shot evenly, whereas if it was unbacked, the plate had to absorb all the energy itself and therefore cracked more easily. And in 1862, the Army and Navy Gazette published a report about a trial between Armstrong guns and the Warrior target that we saw earlier. And it reported that in October 1861, the Warrior target had received shots from a 100-pounder Armstrong gun, a 68-pounder solid shot, and a 100-pound Armstrong gun. This one is a much lighter shot because it's a round shot, whereas this 200-pound solid shot is an elongated shot and is therefore heavier for the same things. And you can see also here where some shells have been fired, which just broke up on impact. But effectively at this stage, the conclusion was reached that armour plate was much better than the guns, and that British ships were invulnerable to anything that people could fire at them. I just want to read this out in full. They went on to say, whenever we've been ready to jump to the conclusion that we've hit upon a powerful resisting object and we have felt inclined to defy the prowess of Sir William Armstrong, the latter has always, in the quietest and meekest of manners, coolly produced a gun which has once again set us thinking about some other modes with which we might defy him. So this is the guns, are now triumphant. Armstrong was built, and in his role as the director of Woolwich, as well as things, has built a more powerful gun. And this is a 300-pounder gun. And you can see on the left there, this is actually fired at the same target as the previous one. So you can see the marks of the old one, the old shells on it. That the 300-pounder shot has shattered the armor plate. And as a result of this test, the Admiralty had to think again completely, because their ships with 4.5-inch armor plates were now vulnerable to heavy guns, which could be mounted on board ships. And this really shows a graph of the impact of that on both the armor makers and the shipbuilders. What these represent is, along the bottom, the quarters of each year. So it starts off 1859, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, and stretches as far as 1870, quarter 4. And what I've done is take an average and a maximum and minimum of the armour fitted to ships which were ordered in that quarter. So on the left here, we've got the Warrior and the Black Prince, all of which had 4.5-inch armour, and therefore the average was 4.5-inch armour. As you get further to the right, you move on in time, you have an average, but you have much thicker armour plate as the heaviest, and thinner, yeah, at the bottom. So you can see roughly from here that there's the Warrior, which had 16% of its armour, of its weight as a ship, made up of armour plate. And there's April 62, which is the test we've just been looking at, that said, the guns are on top of the armour. And it took roughly 2 and a bit years to respond to that and to build the machinery and the plates, which could produce armour plates and ship design, which would resist those new guns. And so the Hercules was 24% of its weight was of armour plate, and you can see that that goes up after that time. Not only that, not only was the armour thicker, but the design of the ship was completely different as well. And we'd moved away from a row of guns, yeah, in a sort of broadside a la Napoleonic Wars, to what was called the central battery design. You actually protect the middle of the ship here with very thick armour, and you protect the guns and the engines in here, and the captain, of course. And you produce far less armour along these bits here because they're less important. And you can see here that the guns were designed to fire forward and back as well. And Hercules was the most formidable ship in the world at the time of its launch in 1868. And it had 8 and 9-inch armour on the central battery, made by John Brown and Co., and 6-inch armour made by Charles Camel and Co. On the rest of the ship. And this is significantly heavier than the armour that had been used before, and actually required really a transformation in the process of making armour. So there were 2 issues, yeah? One was cost, and Charles McLaren, who published the Basic Industries of Great Britain, said improvements in shells and guns and shells had called for heavy armour, which was made by machine tools of such elaborate character that a long purse alone could meet the capital expenditure. In other words, it cost a lot of money to build the machinery to make armoured plate. It was also more complicated because they found that bending the armour plates to the shape of the ship was best done when the armour plates were hot, which meant that it had to be done in the ironworks as opposed to bending them cold in the shipyards, which meant that the ironworks had to invest an awful lot of money in new bending equipment to bend the plates hot. Also, of course, then required complex molds to bend them to the right shape as well. And the reason, the way that most of the armour companies responded to this was to take advantage of the 1862 Limited Liability Companies Act. And we have here some of the armour companies, Samuel Beale of Parkgate and Thames Iron Works we've looked at, and they floated in 1864 for values of around $250,000, slightly less in the case of Thames Iron Works. Part of the reason why their lower valuation is that shipbuilding on the Thames was becoming more difficult. Up north was becoming more profitable because you were nearer to the ironworks and you were nearer to the coal, whereas in London you had to ship it all down there. And the three new entrants who we're going to look at in a bit, John Brown, Charles Camel and Millwall, also floated for values which were much higher. Millwall for significantly more. And I'm not quite sure why that was, because it contradicts my previous point. But so we're going to look at John Brown and Co. now, perhaps the most famous of the armour plate makers, because he was exceedingly good at publicity. And in 1837, he completed his apprenticeship, not as an engineer, as a merchant. He set up his own company in 1844 and moved to very small atlas work in the centre of Sheffield. 1856, he moved to a much larger works in the Don Valley, but still only employing 250 workers. Yeah? This is roughly the sort of time that the first armour plate was being made. And he took on two partners, John Devonshire Ellis and William Bragg, who went on to run the company. And the foundation myth of John Brown is that he decided to make rolled armour plate when he saw the Gloire on a trip to Toulon in 1860. As far as I can work out, this is a complete myth. There are lots of accounts of British tourists being rowed around the Gloire, but the French didn't let them on board for understandable reasons. But I can find no record of him visiting there at all. And the first record I can find is by a journalist called W.T. Jeans in 1864, who wrote a book about pioneers of steel. And I think the actual timeline is something like this, that in 1859, he expanded his factory and laid out a new armour plate facility. The initial trials they made were with hammered armour plate, forged armour plate. In 1859, the Gloire was launched, so they were trying to make forged plates before the Gloire. In 1860, not before the Gloire, but before he could have seen the Gloire. Yeah. In 1860, the Gloire was launched, and in 1860, later in that year, the Warrior was launched. He rolled his first armour plate, and either the 23rd or the 27th of March accounts differ slightly. And he started having his armour plate tested in the same year. And in 1861, he gave his talk to the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in Sheffield, which I spoke of earlier. And here's his factory in the Don Valley. Down the bottom, the original Atlas Works, and he expanded over the Midland Railway, which you can see running across the middle in 1859. This is where he allegedly pasted out on Whit Monday his new armour plate works, which I think is this building here, but I'm not entirely sure. I can't find any accurate maps of it. Next to the Bessemer works, which were here, not Bessemer Works, yes, Bessemer Works, yeah. And this is a picture that he used in his IME talk of the process. And you can see the factory chimneys on the left, and the furnace here with plates piled together, very much as Samuel Beal, described in the process of making it. They've got a pair of tongs which clip onto here. These are the tongs. They clip onto the plate, attach to the rollers, which winches it out, pulls it along to the rollers on the right, where it is rolled, goes out the far side onto a sloping things where it can be pushed back, and goes back and forth through a reversing rolling mill. And this is a picture of a rolling mill by W.H.G. Dawes of Elsecar. And this is one that they made similar to the one that they made for John Brown in 1861. And there's an example of a reversing rolling mill. Basically, you have two large cogwheels here, which are moving in opposite directions, this one and this one. And then you've got a lever here, so you can switch from one to the other. And that enables you to roll back and forth. However, their techniques weren't their own making, really. James Johnson in 1906 reported that his staff had told him sometime previously that John Brown managers used to visit the plant on Sundays and sketch the armour plate mill, and they copied it. And the problems with this copying is, you can see here two pictures in 1860, one-ish, I think, in 1862, where you can see the enormous number of people pulling the armour plate out. And reports of the Beal process say that it ran down of its own accord. But for John Brown's, you need slightly different in the two drawings, which are clearly derived from each other, but about 40 people or so to heave the plate along, because they'd not noticed the incline on the plate mill. They corrected this later on. And John Brown began to challenge the existing armour plate makers with the quality of their armour. And this again is a target. It's the Minotaur target. I rather like it because it's one of the few ones you see of people actually working on the things, especially the chap in the middle, a young cadet from the Royal Artillery, I think, posing in the middle. But these are three plates on it from John Brown and Co., Thames Iron Works and Samuel Beal, the three we've looked at so far. And here are those plates after firing at, and they were described as being the best by John Brown, the weakest by Thames Iron Works, the hammered armoured plate, and the one in the middle from Samuel Beal, which showed imperfections of welding, a problem that Samuel Beal had all the time, because these are 5.5 inches plates, which are clearly much more difficult to, using the same technical language, squish than a 4.5 inch plate. And a quote from Mr. Brown, in terms of making thicker and thicker armour plates, he was basically saying, bring it on. We can build anything. Yeah, we can make as thicker plates as you want. He pledged himself that if the Lords of the Admiralty will build ships large enough to carry his plates, he will produce any quantity capable of resisting all the artillery which can be brought against them. He was an amazing publicist, John Brown, and he wrote a letter along similar lines to the editor of the Army and Navy Gazette, saying that the problems with building guns are far more serious and complex than the problems of building armour plate. All you need for armour plate is bigger bits of machinery, whereas building guns is a far more technically difficult, challenging. Therefore, armour plates are always going to win in the end. Not entirely true, but yeah. So basically, to fulfill the boast he'd made there, he needed to fit more and more heavy equipment into his mill. So his first mill had 22-inch rollers. In 1863, he opened a mill with 32-inch rollers and an engine twice as powerful. And when the Lords of the Admiralty visited to see the opening of that mill, they rolled the plate 12 inches thick, which was significantly thicker than anything rolled before. The Admiralty later did tests on it and decided that it wasn't actually very good, although it was a big step forward. It still hadn't reached the standards required. And the Sheffield Independent basically wrote a piece saying, vast is the extent of the works. It's stuffed with new machinery, very, very costly, and machinery of the most massive character. In 1869, sorry, they opened a new armour mill, which was even bigger. And by that time, the pace of expansion had caused major problems. When they became a public company, John Brown remained as chairman, but they were taken over by a consortium of investors led by a man called Henry Ponchin, who was an industrial chemist from Manchester, who with David Chadwick invested very heavily in armour plate and ironworks. And they were not interested in heavy risk taking. Yeah, John Brown, as the main proprietor, could afford to do that sort of thing, but the shareholders were a bit more reluctant, and Henry Ponchin was quoted as saying that he dared not follow John Brown past a certain point. And there seems to be evidence, because he admitted it and was very open about it, that John Brown was suffering from that stage from mental health problems. He was away from the factory for large amounts of time. From time to time, he took off to the southwest and had holidays. Packed up his belongings and his wife, he said, and went off to rest. I think, having talked to some people about it, that he probably suffered from a mild form of bipolar problems. Whereas he got really manic and decided that he was going to roll the thickest armour plate, but then suffered from depression and anxiety as a result. And he moved on, and John Devonshire-Ellis, who was the manager par excellence, and was able to do a deal with the new shareholders, took over. And this is a theme that actually runs through all the armour plate makers, is the difficulties of paying for all this, and we'll come back to it later on. The Millwall Armour Iron Company was established by C.J. Mayer, the same man who we looked at for the Thames Iron Works, who ran the stable of racehorses, and he was bought out of the company in 1863 because he'd gone bankrupt again, and the 1864 they also went public as the Millwall Ironworks Shipbuilding Graving Docks Company, which was run by the railway contractors, or they had strong investment in it, Peto, Brazy and Betts. So it had a lot of money being put into it because they were extremely well-off people. And John Hughes was the manager of the ironworks from Newport. He went out later on at the end of the Millwall period and set up an ironworks in Donetsk, and it was known as the Iron Tsar, and Donetsk was known as Husakova in Donetsk in the Ukraine. And he took lots of Welsh workers with him there from Newport, from his previous factory, to set that up. And the chairman of the Special Committee on Iron became chairman later on. And this is one of their plates, a picture of it. And interestingly, the last point I got there, John Jeavons, who was ex-armour manager for John Brown and Co., took over the ironworks after John Hughes left. And he was funded jointly by John Brown and Charles Camel, who bought out some patents that John Jeavons had had, and funded him to run the Millwall Iron Company, theoretically one of their competitors, but it's an early indication at the same time that Camel and Browns and Millwall were collaborating together to share out work particularly from foreign armour plate orders. And this is a picture of the Millwall Ironworks. This is the picture of their roller, very, very similar in design to the one at Samuel Beale and John Brown. And one of the reasons why I wanted to look at Millwall in detail is that this picture from the Illustrated London News demonstrates the process quite well, and shows to what extent the techniques pioneered for rolling armour plate, pioneered at Samuel Beale and Co., transferred right across all the armour plate makers. And you've got here the plate coming out of the furnace, being gripped by the tongs. Yeah, you can see the chain here and the tracks to pull it, and you can see no people required to pull the armour plate out. It just goes down the slope to the armour mill, which is here. It's run down, and the plate has gone into the armour plate mill, which is a reversing armour plate mill, and goes back and forth with the plate reversing action, so the plate can go back and forth. And you can see here, just on the plate, working on the plate, probably a man with a broom and a man scattering sand on it, which was basically to bring out the scoria, the impurities in the plate, which came out as a result of the rolling process, and they need to be brushed off the plate. So they weren't included in the final plate. And then here, we mentioned earlier, rolling the plate flat at the end of the process. There's a giant roller, which was used. The plate was carried across with this sort of sling here, put on a flat iron floor, and rolled with that giant roller to flatten it. And all of those things are exactly as described by George Sanderson for the way that Parkgate, Samuel Beale made armour plate. So you can see there that the process has been shared right across the industry, partly by a bit of spying, partly by the deliberate policy of the Special Committee on Iron, and partly by actually different members of staff transferring between the companies, like Joshua Jeevons and other examples. Briefly, what I want to do is look at Charles Camel and Co. This is a rather splendid picture of Charles Camel with his little dog. I just put it in because I like the informality of it. They entered the armour plate process quite late in 1863, and this is a clip from their order book showing the first order of armour plate of iron for making armour plate for 36 quid in February 1863. And they had also become a limited company. And this is, they are one of the few companies of which there are details of their records. So this is why I'm using for this. But this shows the amount of expenditure, capital expenditure, that they were undertaking to stay in the race to be armour plate makers. 1865, 66, 387,000, more the following year, nearly another 100,000, and they still required 380,000 pounds worth of work to be done, totaling 1.162 million pounds, which is an enormous amount of money. Their valuation when they were floated in 1864 was 1 million. So it's, you know, they're putting that much money in again. And in 1866, the Sheffield Banking Company, their shareholder, their bank, refused to make them a loan, demanding additional security. In 1866, they had meetings with large shareholders to explain their financial difficulties. And in 1867, held an extraordinary general meeting of the company in Manchester. A lot of the shareholders came from Manchester. Henry Ponchin came from Manchester, and a lot of their investors did as well. And the problem was that the current capacity of their armour plate mill was 100 tons a week. This could be increased to a maximum of 130 tons a week, with small amounts of investment. The machine shop was at capacity because of the requirement to bend, and drill holes in the armour plate. And their armour plates, their order for armour plates was now 6,000 tons, which had to be delivered in 32 to 36 weeks. Well, if you do a rough calculation of 100 tons per week in 32 weeks, you can see that they're only going to get just over half that amount done. So they really are in major problems. And I don't think this just applied to them. I think this was a problem that everybody was having. And George Wilson, who was the managing director of the company, said that they'd had visits. They'd had serious complaints from the Admiralty about our inattention to orders. I don't think they're being inattentive, they were just struggling. The surveyor of the Admiralty had been sent to several times to see them, but severe ticking off. And George Wilson had been required to visit the controller of the Navy, who's sort of top man in terms of the permanent officials, and he had to beg his forbearance. Nothing short of a pledge that immediate steps would be taken would satisfy the authorities. And they managed to do that. The way they did that was, the problem with the bank was that they hadn't paid Charles Camel all that he was agreed on goodwill for when they bought the company. And they did a deal with Charles Camel whereby they were able to put off that debt and transfer the premises to the new company. And as a result, they were able to borrow on the company's existing premises. And one of the orders that they got in 1867 was for 900 tons of armour for a vessel called HMVS, which stands for, I think at that stage, Her Majesty's Victorian Ship, which was for the Navy of the state of Victoria in Australia, which was for a coastal defence ship for the defence of Melbourne Harbour. And you can see again here that moving on from HMS Hercules, which was a central battery ship. This is the next stage of development, which is what is called, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's basically a ship with two turrets and a sort of large superstructure in the middle, which was much more stable at sea than the old turret ships. This is a plate that they made for it. But they were involved in a long legal battle about late deliveries of armour for that ship. And Palmer's sued Camels for late delivery. But it does appear that the Admiralty supported Charles Camel. That may well be because they had more shipbuilders available to go to than they did armour plate makers. By that date, there were only two armour plate makers, Camels and Browns. So they may have felt that they needed to stick up for Camels. And the final slide that I'm doing is HMS Cerberus, which is actually still there. This is a recent picture of it. It was scuttled to form a breakwater in Melbourne Harbour, where it sits to this day. And you can see the two turrets and the armoured structure amidships, still with all the original armour plate on. The guns have gone, but the ship is still there. And that's the end of the talk. I hope everybody learned something and particularly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I ask for questions, please.
I've got three online, David, from Fred Starr. Fred's made one comment and then two sort of questions, some of which you may have answered already, but I'll run through them. Fred says cast steel was tried and did not do very well. Maybe the carbon content was too high, which is pretty well, yeah, agreed with. Fred says, what was the length and breadth of the armour plates they could roll, and how were the plates attached to the structure of the ship? The pictures show that it was bolted on, but it might be worth just a bit of explanation.
The length of armour plate and the size of armour plate increased over time, and I'm afraid, without actually looking it up, I couldn't give you exact measurements. But the generally speaking, they started off around 15 or so feet long and about 4 foot wide. And over time, I mean, I think in 1863, John Brown rolled a plate which was about 30 foot long. And generally speaking, the idea was that you tried to roll the biggest plates you could, because the greatest weakness of plates when bolted to the side of a ship was on the joins. And if the shot hit on the joins, the impact of the shot wasn't able to be dissipated across such a wide area, because it got stopped at the join between the plates, and therefore did greater damage. The bolts were a problem, and it's not something I've referred to in any great detail. The bolts were made of wrought iron, and the bolts used on the Warrior were a conical bolt. They basically had a conical shaped head, went right through the armour plate, and then through the wood and into the armour plate behind it. One of the problems was that if you got hit near the bolt, the vibrations knocked off the bolt. The bolt? No, not the bolt. The nut. Thank you very much indeed. The nut on the far side, which then, zoomed off, causing mayhem amongst the sailors starting the guns. And this was, in the end, at least partially resolved by the attachment of washers to those, and they started using rubber type washers on them, which absorbed some of the impact. Does that answer the question?
If that's it. Those are the questions online. If anybody else has got questions, either put them on chat, please, or ask to be unmuted and I'll unclear you. One thing that it suddenly struck me when you were talking, David, was that 1864, there was the banking crisis.
Yes.
So in 1864, one of the major banks, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, failed.
Gurney and
Gurney, that was it.
Yeah.
And it took down a number of the railway contractors with it. And this is probably one of the sources why in the year or two round then, everybody was so nervous about lending money on high risk material.
The reason why Millwall went bankrupt, or Charles Mayer went bankrupt the second time, because it does appear, it's a bit murky, but it does appear that he'd taken out and he was involved with something other than Gurney. I can't remember what their first name is offhand, but
Peter was as well, and Brassey was as well.
Yeah. And when that bank went down, Millwall collapsed as a result. Yeah.
Thank you. Two questions. I mean, presumably some of the developments that you're talking about were useful on boilerplate as well, but which was driving it? Was the boilerplate driving the armor plate, or the armor plate driving the boilerplate?
That's a difficult one. I mean, boilerplates were were made by the same method and were difficult to make. So I think a lot of the technology that was used for developing boilerplates was transferred across to armor plates. I think once they started making armor plates and got to a certain thickness, they sort of split into specialist areas to a certain extent. Yeah, because as far as I'm aware, on boilerplates, you're not dealing with those issues of the many layers, yeah, of a boilerplate. You're dealing with a single layer. So I think they started off the same but diverged is what I'm saying.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Now, the second question is, you didn't talk about sort of the development of iron and steel. Were they in parallel with all that work, sort of experimenting with different additives that they could put into the metal to make the metal better for the purpose?
I know there were discussions going on, yeah, and the Committee on Iron carried out chemical analysis of the various plates. They weren't actually able to differentiate plates on that things, and as far as I'm aware, nobody was experimenting with adding alloys, for example, yeah, to the iron to improve its performance. That didn't happen until significantly later. So there were experiments, yeah, but I think they were fairly rough and ready, if you see what I mean. I mean, the points that there was making about the carbon in the steel plates, yeah, you know, that's the sort of level that they were looking at. That's what they could measure, really, and they measured a lot of the quality of the iron by basically fracturing it and looking at it and saying, ah, yes, it looks a bit crystalline, rather than, you know, anything more scientific. Really.
Wrought iron is a very difficult, well, it's a nearly impossible material to alloy. So basically, the process by which you produce wrought iron in puddling gives you only limited chemical control. You've got some control of the physical properties, virtually no control over it. So basically, the main things you're looking for is sulfur, phosphorus, and manganese. You're trying to control for. The only easy way to control that is actually in your selection of materials that you're putting in. Even I did a short spell in the steel industry, and even then, the guys who were doing the melting, if they got good quality scrap coming in, low phosphorus scrap, it was basically squirreled away at the back of the yard for when they knew they were going to have to produce a quality. It was only when you move to Bessemer, you've got slightly more quality control. It's only when you move to open hearth process that you can actually then start to tweak the chemical properties of the melt. And then when you move over to electric arc, of course, you've got even more control over it. So it was a process. The time David's talking on, really wrought iron was king, and Bessemer was just in the wings, and Siemens was coming into the wings, if you follow. So it's very much a transition time, and that's why it's so interesting. It's the end of the wrought iron era, not quite the beginning of the steel era.
Interestingly, since you've mentioned Bessemer, they did trials on Bessemer plates, which were better than Shortridge and Howell's, what they called homogeneous, yeah, crucible steel plates, but still weren't as regarded as good as
it's a totally different story, but it's all down to the fact that it wasn't until you got to the basic acid process with Bessemer that you could produce a steel that was suitable. So it's 1870 about?
Yeah,
about 1870, which was driven by just down the road in Middlesbrough. So very, very complex, but we could go all night on. I can't see anymore. Oh, we've got one. We've got a couple of comments. I'll pick them up. Were the test projectiles all solid, or were some of them shells filled with high explosive? And the other one is, adding other elements would have made it difficult to limit carbon in wrought iron, which is what we're saying.
Yeah. The projectile came in all shapes and sizes. What they did is for many of the tests of armor plates, they used a standard projectile, a solid wrought iron projectile, because you were trying to compare one plate with another, so you needed a standard test. And those were done with an old-fashioned 68-pounder muzzle-loaded gun at very short range, so that you could cluster the shells together. The armor plate was originally done to defeat shells, and they did do a series of tests with shells filled with explosives, and also many tests of shells filled with things like sand, just to sort of see how the shell resists the impact of being against the armor plate. And generally speaking, for a significant length of time, shells were useless in whatever form they because of their hollow nature. They weren't able to penetrate the armor plates. Don't know if that answers the question.
I think that does.
Yeah.
But that's all we've got online. If anybody else has got any online, if not, we'll hand over to Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the questions and comments, and I'm sure the answers satisfied you. We've enjoyed the talk here. I hope the rest have enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Get some nice comments from you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Switch it up. I'll sort it out. At the back.
Thank you. This is obviously the result of many years of investigative work. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.